So, Professor Issa Blumi, I think we can start off agreeing on the point that if 2022 taught us anything, it's that not all wars or their victims are created equal, given that two of the 21st century's deadliest conflicts, namely Ethiopia and Yemen, passed without so much as a mention from the Western media, while the news cycle was consumed with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Having said that, I assume most of my viewers have a basic understanding of the war in Yemen, that it's now in its eighth year, that it began in 2015 when an uprising led by a Zaidi Shia movement known as the Houthis toppled the Saudi and Western backed government from power, and that ever since then, Saudi led GCC states backed by limitless, unconditional Western support have attempted to bomb and blockade Houthi held regions into submission, killing hundreds of thousands of people in the process, and justifying it with the claim that the Houthis are a Iranian proxy. So, given the diplomatic reopening in recent weeks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, I wonder if you can maybe start by commenting on that discourse of this being a proxy war and whether Tehran and Riyadh re-establishing diplomatic ties might suggest that the war could be hopefully about to end.
To answer your last question first, no, the war is not likely to end anytime soon, in large part because the foundations of this conflict go well beyond any interim government that was imposed on Yemen after the events of 2011, and the insistence of especially the American embassy that they are in the driver's seat in terms of where Yemen goes in the subsequent decades moving forward. The resistance that exploded in face of these efforts, again, also has a longer history. And therefore, any kind of resolution that is being made by a new government in Iran, somewhat capitulating to the 30 plus years of pressure being put on the Iranian revolution to the attempt to reverse that revolution, will not have an impact on Yemen. In large part because Iran's involvement in Yemen was limited to giving local support, solidarity, probably out of political necessity for those in power in Iran, as opposed to offering serious logistic support. Yemen, as you noted, the northern part of that country, which has been under the governance of a coalition known as Ansar Allah, which includes some of the remaining elements of what was this movement emerging around Hussein al-Houthi, a parliamentarian in the 1990s who led a spirited resistance to the then dictator of choice of the West, Ali Abdullah Saleh, whose primary role was to mediate the alliances that ultimately led to the unification of Yemen, to bringing all the varied assets of Yemen's considerable economic potential under the let's say authority of a central state that would be following the lines of a traditional military dictatorship. And again, throughout this period of resistance, there was really no solidarity, no support, other than lip service being paid by Tehran. Probably a little bit more sympathies coming from regions of resistance, like in Lebanon, amongst Hezbollah ideologues who understood their situation also as something external to the Iranian revolution and its struggle with the West. It's not that these minor minority peoples in various parts of the Arab world look up to Iran to the point of ultimately deferring their raison d'etre, their very existence, to the interest of Iran. Hezbollah is certainly another example of an organization that is yes, in some ways logistically benefiting from the support, material support from Iran, but certainly someone who can operate independently if necessary. And the situation in Yemen is even more exaggerated in terms of Yemenis' independence from the larger story of Iran's struggle with the West and its proxies, especially the Gulf countries. There has been no cultural connection. Even though there's all constant reference to the Zaidi being a Shia group, they are a very distinctive Zaidi, a very distinctive community after the death of Hussein, the Prophet Muhammad's grandson. That tradition has long been one that shaped the relations between various, what we would call Shia communities, whether it be Ismaili or Zaidi, or these what we call Twelver Shia in Iran. So I'm sure your listeners are familiar with this distinction, and it needs to be emphasized in this regard because Iran, again, was playing lip service. The embassy did have some attempt to influence some of the politics because their rivals in the Gulf were very much invested in Yemen. But that was the extent of their investment in Yemen itself, because they did not have the ideological, theological, or and sometimes political shared interest with those primary actors who were fighting in the mountains against the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh in the early 90s.
Having discounted the whole narrative about this being really a proxy war, as we've said, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I understand your main area of expertise is the Middle East history from the Ottoman era to the present, with particular regard to Yemen. So, what can you tell us of the historical background that really led to this conflict? What are its actual causes?
Yemen constitutes a series of regions. Yemen as a concept is a basic geographical reference to the right of Mecca, Medina. It is historically a very important crossroads of commercial enterprises, as well as therefore political actors who, during the late phase of the Ottoman Empire, when they reestablished, say, associations with Southwest Arabia out of strategic interest in the 1870s onwards, they did so on the basis of recognizing that the British had already established a working relationship first with the British East India Company, so as a commercial enterprise, investing in influencing and backing up certain polities led by sultans that the British preferred to operate and work with, signing treaties with individuals and therefore empowering them to maintain the benefits of economic relations with Southwest Arabia, which were minimal. It was a point of transit. But by the 1870s, with the opening of the Suez Canal, this became a very important strategic choke point that all the major powers invested influence in, and the Ottomans were no exception. But to a large extent, Yemen can and does continue to dictate the terms of their relations with the larger world. Yemenis who live in the very high mountains that come some 30 kilometers off the coast of the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea to the south are basically impossible to conquer militarily with ground troops. And this has been demonstrated with this current war as well. And even with superior air power, or a monopoly of use of violence with using air power still does not subordinate and force submission. So Yemenis were and understand this situation, are able to make significant demands, and were very much big players in shaping the nature of inter-imperial rivalries in this area. So they were able to negotiate. And this is a story that continues on throughout the 20th century with the imamate, which is often associated exclusively, again, with the reference to them being Zaidi led, let's say, inner core or council of leaders who are shaped by Zaidi principles, which are themselves religious, but also social, economic, as well as political. And the Ottomans would have to negotiate on the terms of these various communities. And the same would apply then when the Ottoman Empire collapses after World War I. We must highlight that the Ottomans and their alliance with Imam Yahya, who would be the leader of northern Yemen up until his death in 1948, and his sons would then succeed until the revolution of 1962, was very much someone, while he was accused of being isolationist, was very much someone with an eye towards the larger world, and was very familiar with the dynamics of the larger world, and was trying to avoid the very processes that led to, for instance, Palestine being the center of colonization, to much of the former Ottoman territories in the Arab world being occupied by French or British-led administrations. So by the end of World War I, you have a country that is making overtures to the larger world, trying to rally the Arab world and the Islamic worlds to resist the encroachments of global capitalism on very explicit terms that sounds like a Marxist in many ways, but still a religious leader, someone who's basing his resistance to this on Islamic principles, on the incurring debts and paying interest on debt is, in Islamic terms, like in early Christianity, condemned by the decrees of God, right? And so we cannot get involved in this economic mechanisms that is fundamentally in opposition to our values. And the capitulation of all the regimes around northern Yemen made it especially clear that Yemen had to take on the position of being a fortress against the encroachments of what was basically capitalist imperialism. And that subordinated even the neighbors to the north under the Hashemite kingdom of Mecca and Medina that had secured independence thanks to British support, to the Saudis, who also became the primary agent of British influence in the region and therefore benefited from territorially expanding, and so on and so forth, especially in the areas southern Yemen, which became the hub of British imperialism in the interwar period, to try to influence events in East Africa, to maintain access to India. Yemen, as a geography, remained very hot in terms of colonial imperial capitalist interests, and North Yemen remained independent, the only, indeed, Islamic state to remain independent after World War I. And they remained principled to the extent that they even, when they joined, for instance, the United Nations in 1947, the first thing that they were the first state to actually condemn the events taking place in Palestine, the transference, if you will, from a British mandate to the creation of an independent Jewish state at the expense of the indigenous population of the region.
So, can we consider Ansar Allah, the international media call the Houthis, are they the political successors of this North Yemeni imamate, basically?
Yeah. So this is where it gets quite complicated, because the imamate by 1962 faced the gauntlet of the transformations of the larger Arab world, in which Nasser supposedly represented an alternative to the monarchy model that especially the Americans and Britain had embraced as a workable relationship with semi-independent sovereign states that continued to assure that the resources that the West coveted, especially after World War II, oil was crucial to American influence, not only in Europe, which depended on subsidized oil, but also East Asia, as Korea, Japan rebuilt. They needed the subsidized, very cheap oil coming from these countries that became now quasi-recognized independent monarchies. And the model moving forward for the alternative, a republic of some sort, which is only on paper a republic. These are mostly military dictatorships that are ruled by a small cadre of officers associated with a political party, whether it be Ba'athist party or something along the lines of a Nasserist party, or their variations elsewhere. Um, there was an interim period in which North Yemen faced a serious kind of identity crisis in its relationship to the larger world. And a lot of influence was coming from these advocates of a Republican model. And it's often a misplaced juxtaposition between the so-called imamate, which was in the subsequent historiography treated as a monarchy, as a simple tool of either the West, by the very fact that there was some support for the resistance to Nasser's expansion of influence in northern Yemen by Saudi Arabia, which had no intention of allowing the return of this ruling family, imamate family, that had historically been at war with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia today occupies a large swath of northern Yemen, precisely the region from which most of these so-called Zaidi families that are still in resistance in alliance with Ansar Allah come from. So the war that we see today is actually a continuous war of trying to reverse the de facto annexation of large parts of this very productive highland territories with lots of water comes from the monsoon rains. These are very industrious people who have long remained, well, again, impervious to the outside world's transformations. They could defend themselves, but for some interesting reasons, a significant half of that region, called the Asir and Jizan and Najran today, in southwest Saudi Arabia, is historically and culturally Yemeni per se, or North Yemen. And that's been an area since 1934 under direct occupation, with subsequent efforts at social engineering. There's been ethnic cleansing happening, especially Ismaili and Zaidis have been persecuted. A significant investment in bringing in colonists from other parts of Saudi Arabia to settle these areas, translated into generations of conflict in that area, and instability that is something that was primarily of primary strategic interest for a unified Yemen state, a republic from 1962 until 1989 to settle. And this is something that Saudi Arabia and its main, let's say, supporters out there, especially the United States, have been trying to find a long-term solution for. So this story of Yemeni independence functioning as an independent, self-contained enterprise that includes variations of certain kinds of states extends historically back to the Ottoman period for sure, throughout the 20th century, and regardless if it's an imamate or a republic, the personality of the people who make these polities, they're largely dysfunctional since the revolution of 1962, but they all have a certain set of principles which cuts across these sectarian lines. It cuts across even some of the regionalism it's very important to consider about Yemen. As I started this interview, said that Yemen actually constitutes a series of different regions that sometimes manifests in very distinctive political agendas for certain groups who represent these areas. And so bringing Yemen together is an enterprise that is a constant struggle. And it's something that obviously is an albatross on any efforts to actually unify this region. And the very fact that Ali Abdullah Saleh, the dictator of choice, who removed the last really kind of spirited anti-Western, anti-capitalist leader, a man named Ibrahim Hamdi, in 1977, and was able to establish himself on the basis of this coup that he was part of, mostly likely engineered by the help of Egyptian and American intelligence, French intelligence perhaps, Saudi intelligence. His primary task is to somehow make sure that this Yemeni enterprise in northern Yemen does not translate into violence that threatens southwest Saudi Arabia. Um, in time, they start to realize there's actually significant economic windfall if they can actually consolidate the authority of this authoritarian government in Sana'a, the northern capital, and pursuing the opportunity that was opened up with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The southern Marxist state that had been able to secure independence from the British and consolidate in some miraculous way and create a viable state called South Yemen for a period from 67 until 1985, 86, started to fall apart and became vulnerable to the politics of influence that came from neighboring regions. There was a coup in 86, change of government led to, and probably reflected, a fundamental political weakness in southern Yemen, which again had remained quite independent of northern Yemen. There was even several wars throughout the 70s and 80s between these two states, supposedly on different sides of this Cold War equation. But because South Yemen now became available with the end of the Cold War, the project in which Ali Abdullah Saleh was commissioned to do on behalf of the larger interest of the region and probably global powers changed as well, which is to advocate for and pursue a unification of this vast territory with very distinctive, again, traditions and associations with the larger world. And there's all kinds of interesting dynamics that influence and shape the evolution of what we call the Houthi movement, and eventually the creation of this broad coalition called Ansarullah today.
I just wanted to briefly make one more reference back to the Zaidi imamate. So there isn't a direct, or is there a direct family connection between present Houthi family tribe in charge in Sana'a and the imamate, or is there no connection and they just claim the political legacy of the imamate?
They're claiming a political legacy not on the grounds of their Zaidi qualities per se, but the kind of underlying principles that the imamate represented in this crucial transitional period in the 20th century, where North Yemen remained independent from the influences, the tarnishing exploitation of sectarianism that came with British and American arrival into Middle East. They're not advocates of sectarianism. Zaidi tradition, legally, in the legal sense, is much more closer to the regional Sunni school of jurisprudence called the Shafi. There's been much more correspondence and willingness to work within dual legal systems, but they would tap into each other's legal traditions, if you will, to adjudicate day-to-day life. So this is what really makes these distinctive communities in the Islamic world so distinctive, is their interpretive texts that are used as models to rule over the day-to-day affairs of life in society. We have a Western code that's become more or less a generic one, where in the pre-modern world, all of our societies had very distinctive traditions, if you will, which is what is the Zaidi one compared to the Shafi one, compared to the Hanbali one, or Hanafi one, which is more predominant in the larger Islamic world. So this is important to highlight, there's been this history of constant cohabitation and collaboration. Being a Zaidi did not constitute being separate from the larger community. The imamate in itself was a project of consolidating and cooperation. There was constant negotiation. The imam was simply a model, an ideal kind of political character. So that could be a reference that those who are in the struggle today are making, is the ideal leader, a political leader who's also a warrior, a fighter, someone who doesn't sit in the protection of behind guards and sits far away. He's actually participating in the struggle. You demonstrate your ability to be a leader, to being a leader on the battlefront, at the political front, all these complicated negotiations that are required in a society like Yemen, and also at the intellectual level. You need to be a scholar of some sort. You need to know your sources. You need to know what you're talking about. You need to be eloquent. You need to be able to engage a broad range of society. So, in other words, and that's the kind of working model. Now, Western scholars and the opponents of the Zaydis who want to constantly reimpose this sectarian dynamic are misrepresenting the nature of politics inside Yemen. Which again, unfortunately, in Yemen itself, there's been enormous influence by the fact that Yemenis have, in large numbers, have now been living in places like Saudi Arabia for several generations now. So upwards of 1 million Yemenis who, prior to the first Gulf War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, over 1 million Yemenis, breadwinners for their much larger families back in Yemen, were living in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And they were being indoctrinated and became culturally much more Saudi in the terms of the Wahhabi kind of orientation, which was referring to, for instance, Yemen's heritage as antithetical to Islamic teaching. So people developed this attitude that back home we're backward. Back home we're this old monarchy that's medieval, and this was very explicitly being marketed in Arabic scholarship since the 1960s, from the Republican side to justify the revolution that they were promoting in Yemen, that we need to modernize Yemen, to bring Yemen into the developed world. Kind of a language that was very popular in the 1950s and 60s, both in the Marxist centered universe of the Soviet Union, who were promoting reversing tradition, but also in JFK's America and Eisenhower's America. They were also promoting modernizing the Arab world, modernizing Africa by doing away with these religious communities and these references to Islamic jurisprudence. And Saudi Arabia was an important instrument in that their quietist message to their people: stay out of politics. You have no responsibility. You will be led. Basically, a classic rentier regime was established in the Gulf, which then was supposedly then transferred by way of education to countries that could not afford to stay out of politics. Yemen was too poor to actually not have people who are on a day-to-day basis having to fend for themselves. There's no state giving them stipends as we would have in Saudi Arabia or UAE or Kuwait. So politics was necessary. And yet you have people who are coming from Saudi Arabia who have then a very different set of orientations because of their indoctrination. They went to school in Saudi Arabia. They listened to exclusively Saudi preachers on radio, television. They were forced to conform to live like Saudis when they lived there. Now, when they were expelled, and in some ways, if you calculate, they were probably expelled for strategic purposes, specifically to induce the anticipated conflict that 1 million plus such minded Yemenis. I mean, they brought their women back. They started wearing niqab. This was something unheard of in Yemen before. They brought this whole attitude that women need to stay out of society, not be participants in day-to-day exchanges at the commercial level or day-to-day exchanges at the political level. That's something that was quite new, thanks to this phenomenon of migration to the Gulf. So they brought back this very conservative, very different kind of very un-Yemeni attitude, and that transformed in itself Yemen society. They became a huge burden on Yemen society because they were basically people who no longer provided money, send it back to Yemen. They couldn't find jobs in a Yemen that was no longer able to accommodate a huge influx of their citizens coming from elsewhere. And in the meantime, they were then identified by Saudi embassy, by Qatari embassy, and by the Americans, by the way, to help fulfill the other strategic objectives not only inside Yemen itself, which was to make sure Yemen remained destabilized, but stabilized. This was the thesis of my book called Chaos in Yemen, is that you would have chaos, but contained within the confines of a Yemeni territory, which Ali Abdullah Saleh would help maintain and manage. And in the meantime, use the excess humanity, if you will, in this very nasty attempt to try to survive the poverty that was induced by these events around the expulsion of million plus Yemenis from the Gulf, to recruit young men to go and fight as what becomes known as Al-Qaeda elsewhere in the world, whether it be in the early stages in Afghanistan. Bin Laden family originally is from Yemen. Of course, Osama bin Laden, notoriously a major recruiter of Takfiri soldiers who would be sent off to the larger world, would actually be given that portfolio, if you will, of recruiting on behalf of CIA in places like Yemen. And in the meantime, these Yemenis who were all indoctrinated in Saudi kind of understanding, developed their own sense of political enterprise, and they became a political agent, an actor. They didn't exist before. You didn't have these Wahhabi, Takfiri types as political actors in Yemen before 1990, 91. But they came on with a storm, and they started to dictate the nature of entire Yemen politics. This is happening exactly at the same time when Yemen is unified. Now, the unification is important because in 1990, 91, there was a lot of hope and belief that Yemen would become the superpower of the region if they unified. And they were all on both sides very gung-ho about this idea of becoming a unified Yemen that could finally address the injustices of the larger world. Ideologically, the people of the North, still drawing from the old Imamate period, who were always preaching the idea of Arab unification. They were the first ones to pursue a unified Arab state with Egypt, with Syria, with Iraq. People forget this, but North Yemen, the so-called isolated Imamate, medieval Imamate, was very much connected to the larger world. He allowed advisors from Maoist China, from Yugoslavia, from the Soviet Union, even the Swedes, and even Americans. So he was trying to put North Yemen into a kind of a non-aligned relationship with the larger world, where he would benefit from their generosity. He understood, or the Yemenis understood, their wish to have influence in this otherwise unpenetrated and independent part of the Islamic world. But at the same time, he was making overtures and was one of the first ones to support the Free Officers revolt in Egypt. He supported the Algerian resistance. He supported Palestinians' resistance against Israel. And up until 1961, there was a military alliance. He was part of this larger Arab state that actually had Egypt and Syria form a unified Arab republic. So those people, that generation, was still alive in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, and they had, on principles, promoted this idea of Arab unity. Unification of Yemen, because that would be a means to actually project Yemen as a defender of human rights, of Muslim rights, of Arab rights, of the global South. They were making overtures through South Yemen's ideologues to the larger world. I mean, South Yemen was a major supporter of insurgencies throughout the 70s in East Africa. This was all coming to a head that made it possible that Yemen would be a significant state moving forward. Under already mid-1980s, I described this in my book, Destroying Yemen, under the Vice President of the United States, George Bush, he makes a trip to Yemen in 1986 to promote the opening up of oil wells on the borders between South and North Yemen. Now, South Yemen is supposed to be this horrible Marxist, anti-capitalist state, and yet you have the Americans already rubbing their hands with the idea that they have just probably been involved in this coup that led to a change of government in Aden, in the capital of South Yemen, with this, and promoted this idea of unification because they wanted access to this huge potential of oil wealth, both in on the territories, but also offshore, as well as controlling the Bab el-Mandab, which has long remained a strategic concern for powers like the United States that have maintained a global reach.
Having filled in the background of the imamate as being the main ideological point of reference for Ansarullah today, how that you're aware of, how have they adapted their political program? Like, presumably, it's not just a carbon copy of the stances of the imamate. Like, have they innovated politically?
Oh, absolutely. Again, Yemen has transformed itself, but even at this early stage of unification, it became clear that this was a conflicted process that was animated external enemies especially the peoples of the northwest of Yemen. Those people were what we would identify geographically as the core of the Zaidi region. The highlands from Sana'a north towards Saada, the major city of this first where Hussein al-Houthi is originally from. He would become a member of parliament in this early parliamentary governments that was quite unique in the Arab world at this stage, by the way. Very open elections in 1993, very contested ones. That was, again, another reign of hope. There was something that the Yemen could actually be going in a different direction. But at the same time, the machinations of especially the Americans and Saudi Arabia were primarily concerned about Yemen becoming the superpower of the region, an alternative to what was on offer after the Cold War, which was not very much, right? It was basically capitulate to the offerings of money that would come from the Gulf, or face the gauntlet of American suppression, like we saw in Iraq and regularly in Syria, under threat in Syria. Algeria saw already in the mid-1990s a horrible civil war in which these same Takfiri elements that I'm saying has infiltrated Yemen at this stage because they were being expelled from Saudi Arabia has also now implicated Algeria into a war that would lead to hundreds of thousands of deaths. So this was this was basically on offer for Yemen if the political class around Ali Abdullah Saleh and his party, the GPC, the General People's Congress, did not step up their efforts of consolidating influence. And again, the primary region of the north, the peoples who grew up in these areas, associated with the imamate, but again, not exclusively because of their Zaidi associations, were beginning to face new challenges with the arrival of this whole new generation of Takfiri elements. If your audience don't understand what Takfiri is, it's a reference to groups, radical Islamic groups who refer to other Muslims as kufar or kafir, which means infidel. This is unheard of in Islamic history, that you would actually collectively condemn a whole population as being un-Islamic or un-Muslim, even though they themselves profess being Muslims. That's a phenomenon that comes from Saudi Arabia after the 1960s. And so this whole element that is leading to horrible war and instability in Iraq, in Algeria, Sudan, is also now in Yemen, in Somalia. Somalia is going to go through the throes of this process as well. Somalia's story and Yemen's story of disaggregation and of chaos is very much runs parallel to each other. And even the periodization is the same. It's quite interesting. But back to this whole idea of this legacy of what the imamate represented. It represented not only a system of jurisprudence, of governance, but also of an ideal, which again, it crossed sectarian borders. It crossed the boundaries of these regions. The areas of what today is middle Yemen, they say the front lines, if you will, of this war that has gone on since 2014 between the Ansar Allah's coalition and those being supported by the West under this interim government that's supposedly recognized by the international community, is the border area is Taiz, the city, the second city. It used to be the capital of the imamate. They very explicitly made it the capital in order to integrate these predominantly Sunni farming communities of that part of Yemen. And so the front lines of what the current war is all about is about also how do we pursue our relationship with our neighbors. And the fact that in the early 90s, especially in this northwest area, which was on the border, this contested border with Saudi Arabia, the fact that the people had been constantly waging small scale conflicts that made it very difficult for Saudi Arabia to ever actually establish authority along these borders, had resulted in Saudi Arabia making the long-term concession that we'll basically keep this border open. We'll allow sheep herders to bring their flocks back and forth. We'll allow people that traditionally went to the other side of the border to go and get water or to meet family, to do business. But with the unification of Yemen, with now the integration of this significant state of some 25 million people, with probably the most sophisticated, well-trained army inherited from South Yemen, they actually had a battle with Saudi Arabia over some contested islands, and the Yemenis defeated handedly in 1990-91 Saudi forces. So this was a warning for the future. This dynamic, very vibrant, large population with recognized huge supplies of oil and gas yet to be tapped into made a long-term strategic concern for especially Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser extent, its other Gulf rivals, Qatar and UAE. And so they all invested heavily in trying to influence the politics of Yemen. And the principle that we don't want these outsiders, especially these puppets of this enterprise called to these days neoliberal globalization, which is just simply an extension of what we've been fighting for the last 100 years in parts of Yemen. Remember, South Yemen was a very principled Marxist state that had went through a very nasty war with the British Empire to secure independence. So those people share very much the same kind of reference point, if you will, from a majority of people, whether they consider themselves the descendants of this imamate idea or not, whether they see themselves as Republicans or as Nasserists. They all share this fundamental common understanding of Yemen's place in the world. So you had what we would call Yemen nationalism, but projects that were being disrupted by the very fact that you had these Takfiri elements being paid for and empowered by the U.S. Embassy. There were now significant pockets of Yemeni territory that were no-go zones. They were zones of training for these troops that were coming from many parts of the Arab world, who would then be sent off to these theaters of conflict throughout the Islamic world in the 1990s, and they were emanating from Yemen, and they were largely being protected by the Americans and to an extent Ali Abdullah Saleh, who used then these very same forces to secure power in these contested borderline areas, probably with significant demands coming from the Americans and Saudi Arabia itself, because the instability that what had long existed, the potential for this blowing out of proportion, which the Saudis would not be able to control, was manifest once Yemen became unified. They literally went to war with each other, and the Saudis lost very badly. And now you begin to start seeing this Yemeni spirit again, saying we're going to retake our territories we lost in 1934. People on both sides were mobilizing for that. And you can see throughout the 1990s, even Western think tanks were beginning to write reports about this phenomenon of Southwest Saudi Arabia being very unstable. And so they started investing heavily in, again, social engineering, colonization, expelling large numbers of indigenous population who lived there, and also invested in this militarization of this zone, which was not accepted in the past. And that's what led to immediate confrontation with the peoples who are associated today with Ansarullah and Houthis.
Is that the next stage of the war, do you think, that the Houthis, Ansar Allah, will at some point actually try to seize back what are currently southwest Saudi Arabian provinces?
Well, Najran and Jazan and the larger Asir region, which is what we call this area, has been in this state of instability since 1934. But with unification in 1990, 91, we've had that brief war over the islands. And then with the countermeasures being imposed from Saudi Arabia's side, but also in Sana'a by the government, Ali Abdullah Saleh, the war has been and the theater for this conflict that again it's a regional conflict in the fact that half of that region had been taken and annexed by Saudi Arabia since the 1930s, not able to assert full authority yet, but by the 1990s they're beginning to now do that, which leads to ethnic cleansing, which leads to targeting Ismaili and Zaidi populations specifically Yemeni populations, and replacing them with colonists from elsewhere. Even just simply Indian workers, just to put people on the ground and make an enterprise of building and bringing Saudi state presence to this region on the borders with northern Yemen. And that induces a new wave of violence inside northern Yemen itself. And Ali Abdullah Saleh, with Saudi support, are actually now invest in actually trying to colonize those areas with these Takfiri groups, with these Wahhabi type groups. So you start to see a phenomenon of schools being plopped up right in the heart and center of these supposedly Zaidi regions of the far north. And this is happening at a time when there's still parliamentary elections, there's still contestation going on at the very civil context of debates in parliament. And this Hussein al-Houthi, who becomes the face of the so-called Houthi movement, is coming, that's the context from which he's coming and actually going to Sana'a and saying, my constituencies here are the constituencies of all Yemenis, because we are at the forefront of this battle with our evil enemy, Saudi Arabia, which to a large extent, with the exception of those radicalized Yemenis who came back from Saudi Arabia just at this time, most Yemenis despise Saudi Arabia and the very idea of a Saudi Arabia, of a Gulf. There's a lot of resentment at the economic level, but also there's an understanding ideologically that these are simply puppets of an enterprise that, again, collectively Yemenis, whether they eventually went the Marxist way in the south or variations in northern Yemen, they all have a common agreement that these are fundamentally evil enterprises that need to be stopped. And this is what makes the current war so important, because and this is why there's so much investment in trying to make this a proxy war between Iranians and Saudis, or between Sunni and Shia. It's not that. Now, there are radicalized, self-identified Sunni Takfiris who are in this story, but they're mostly, I would say, some of them have embraced the idea that they are also Yemenis again, and they want to actually take political control of a Yemeni enterprise, but they are the minority, and they've always remained the minority. Now, Ansar Allah, that manifests ultimately and becomes a coalition, is out of necessity because of Hussein al-Houthi's political struggle that goes nowhere in Sana'a. There's a lot of pressure from, again, Saudi Arabia, the American embassy, the Germans, to not countenance, to not give much time to this serious regional problem that the peoples of the Northwest have with their neighbors to the north. And basically the state is in Yemen, the Yemeni state under Ali Abdullah Saleh has now turned to trying to discipline this region, trying to bring this region into the fold of a direct control from the government inside Sana'a itself. And these regions have been impervious to direct rule for thousands of years. Yemenis in general are like that. We don't accept a dictates from some capital city, from some office. Politics has always been of negotiation. These so-called tribes that Yemen is heralded to have amongst anthropologists coming from the West are in fact constituencies that are local, that have considerable firepower. I mean, it's quite fascinating to travel in Yemen. I was there the first time just when they became unified. I was able to travel to the farthest corners, and each town had a roadblock. There was no state. Everything was negotiated at the immediate moment, which is
Very
fascinating.
small R Republican.
Small R Republican, which in many ways is much more democratic if you think about it. If you can still allow for this negotiated process to take place, they're not disrupted. They're not saying we refuse to cooperate in the larger context. They have an idea of Yemen as a unified state. This something is appeals to a lot of these people because it means that this actually can represent their interest in a larger scale. Right? Many of these communities have international links. They have cousins who have established a life in Malaysia or in East Africa. I mean, that goes back for millennia, right? So they need a state to represent them. They understand that. They just don't want some corrupt politician like Ali Abdullah Saleh, who represents the interest of the Americans and Saudi Arabia first, to be the one who dictates those terms. Let's have a parliament, which was a concession until 1993, at least, that was made in this unification process. And Ansar Allah, or let's say Hussein al-Houthi, who is again a very, very articulate man in parliament. He is a spokesperson not just for his region anymore. People around Yemen recognize that what he's saying is a part of their story too. And the very fact that the government of Yemen is cooperating and working in tandem with Western embassies and Saudi Arabia to now implot these radical elements who are basically from their enclaves, heavily protected enclaves. They're heavily armed. They're getting weapons and training from God knows whom, from the Saudi, American, we don't know, but they're well armed. They have the support of the Yemeni government, and they're projecting this hatred towards the peoples around them. Not only in the north, by the way, not only amongst Zaidi, but amongst the old communists, amongst these other Sufi communities that existed throughout southern Yemen. So this is a big problem. By 1994, it explodes into a civil war, in which the northern part of Yemen is largely left out of. It's a war between the central state and the former rulers of South Yemen, and those parties in South Yemen that realize they're being taken over by these radical elements who were trained in Saudi Arabia. Why is the government in Sana'a supporting this? And it became this war which they ultimately would lose out in 1994. And that just unleashed then a new phase of the conflict between the state in Sana'a, Ali Abdullah Saleh, by extension, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and these regions. And the one that really stands out today, the one that remained resilient and in resistance and faced the gauntlet of Yemen's now expanded military capacity, was the north part. To the extent that Sana'a was bombed on many occasions by the Yemeni military. This is an outrage if you consider the loss of civilian life during this period. And in the meantime, there are continuously militarization of the borders between North Yemen and its historic extension into Saudi territories, and ultimately an agreement between Sana'a, Ali Abdullah Saleh, the government of Yemen, with Saudi Arabia to delineate the actual borders, which was a capitulation ultimately. The Yemeni had surrendered its historic demands to retake those areas that they see as Yemeni. So it was a betrayal over some 10-year period of this idea of unifying Yemen. It was a betrayal of this idea that Yemen has extraterritorial concerns with its rapacious, corrupt, American-influenced neighbors to the north. And they're bringing in this completely alien culture, allowing for it to fester and actually to induce conflicts in a variety of communities throughout Yemen. And it's all because of this Ali Abdullah Saleh and his soul being sold to the devil, so to speak. And this induced the kinds of conflicts that eventually leads to 2010, 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, which in Yemen has a very different trajectory than, let's say, Egypt or Syria or elsewhere.
Well, you mentioned briefly the very long-lived and very large Yemeni diaspora in everywhere from East Africa to Malaysia and Indonesia. What I've wondered over the years of the war since 2015, has the government in Sana'a, has Ansarullah actually developed meaningful relationships and made political inroads in countries as far away as Malaysia and Indonesia through these Yemeni contacts?
Yeah, this is a tough, an interesting question because traditionally those who sent out cousins and sons to go and find a better life, either as merchants historically, they would be coming more largely from these coastal cities or the areas that had direct links in the hinterland to a maritime trade. So we would associate them with southern Yemenis, or we would call Hadrami. So those are the ones who populated the Indian Ocean world, and many of them became ruling families in the sultanates of what today is Malaysia or the islands of Indonesia or East Africa. And then you had a generation of Yemenis from what today is the north, who became the equivalent of coolie labor. The British, especially, were heavily, they needed labor to maintain their imperial presence in southern Yemen. And they had to import labor. They brought a lot of labor from India, of course, but they also started to recruit heavily poor farming peoples from the areas around Taiz. And then many of them ended up in places like London, Liverpool. So they joined the global workforce of the industrial era and ended up being scattered. And by very fact of as I mentioned before, about the million plus Yemenis who migrated to more local areas, so just to the Gulf, to provide the lion's share of the service economy's needs in those countries. There were construction workers, but also police officers. There were also hired hands in military and security, which makes that dynamic also very, very interesting. But also tells you the investment then by these societies that are hiring them in making sure that they don't become problematic. Now, we saw what happened after they rose up collectively to support Saddam Hussein in an invasion of Kuwait, giving it to those nasty Gulf sheikhs who do nothing but just eat all day long and treat us like crap in our day-to-day lives. They were collectively being punished and sent back, but there was already intelligence embedded inside these communities that knew that they would actually be easily manipulated to shape the politics in Yemen, as I described previous section of this interview. So those people from the far north, they are present in diaspora, but many of them who are present in the workforce have been away from home for a long time. They run small businesses in Detroit or in New York, so they've been, or in parts of Europe. You can find them everywhere, and they still have this strong sensibility of being Yemeni, regional. They identify themselves as being part of certain regions. They still speak dialect until 2010. Let's say they were able to travel back on occasion. They invested their money back into their family village. But they've also been acculturated by the very fact that they've lived for 20, 30 years in America. So you have second generation now who are American or who are British. And unfortunately, they are consuming a lot of the same kind of language about Yemen that your audience does. And it's sometimes quite hard for parents, as we all know, to pass on your traditions to the generation that grows up listening to hip hop and grows up in tough neighborhoods of Detroit, and they're more concerned about acclimatizing themselves to the society there. And so there's a sad irony that I think more and more Yemenis from abroad are feeling more and more proud about this resistance, but they also feel a little bit reticent to actually express that because they may be still Muslims, for instance, but they're going to mosques that are completely controlled by Qatar or Saudi Arabia or Turkey. It's very hard to take an alternative position politically in your community, even if you're practicing Muslim. The institutions themselves in the West or in other parts of the world are very much funded by Saudi Arabia or Qatar, and therefore the imams there, and then so it's a very controlled environment in the diasporas in Australia and elsewhere, and so it's hard to be uh, different. Even in Scandinavia, you had a lot of violence against even 12er Shia mosques. It's very hard to live as a Shia in the diaspora. It's very hard to live as a Sufi in many European cities. I mean, the Moroccan workers who came in the 50s and 60s, they were not radicalized Islamic. I mean, they were drinking and they were having parties and listening to music. And then their kids go to these Islamic schools that are funded by Saudi Arabia, and they suddenly tell their parents that they're kafir. And I don't want to deal with you. And they start wearing the long beards, and they want wives with niqab. So it's the same phenomenon that happened to the Yemenis. So those who end up in diaspora are either completely secularized and have abandoned their heritage, their religion at least, become politically animated by the current politics, which they hear only through the filter of the West, and then they take the position that the Houthis are proxies of the Iranians, and that folds over to those Takfiri elements who grow up as Muslims, but in a context of the West or if in the diaspora that is controlled entirely by Qatar, Turkey, or Saudi Arabia. And so for they also see this pocket of resistance in Yemen as something that is backward, it's not Islamic, and something that needs to be changed. So this is the sad irony of the diaspora, is that it's a very complicated universe in which, in many ways, the people who live in Yemen are very different from the people who live in the diaspora. Even though they have immediate connections, they try to communicate under this 8 years of siege. And that's is an important element in the future, because my prediction in the end is that Yemen is divided forever. It's no longer going to be a unified country. Just like Iraq will never be a unified country, Syria is never a unified country. They've ripped apart Egypt and Sudan. Algeria maybe can still survive. We don't know. Libya is a forgotten story. It's completely torn apart. It'll never be unified again as a Libya.
So you're not actually confident about the Houthis, Ansarallah's prospects of actually winning this conflict?
Well, they could win the conflict, but they will not be able to secure the subsequent results of this success. In many ways, they won by surviving. The Ansarullah and the coalition that extended to Ali Abdullah Saleh's army. I mean, he built, with American support, a Republican army of 300,000 forces who were the best trained in all of the Arab world, and very sophisticated weapons. And most of them, when this Arab Spring happened, and then they started to realize who's trying to influence the direction of the Arab Spring in Yemen, they took the sides of what becomes known as the Houthis, the principled nationalist Yemenis who are not ideological, they're not sectarian, they want to protect Yemen. And that's what Ansarullah is. It's not a Zaidi movement, it is a Yemeni movement. And it's not a regional one. It's something that cuts across even a large support in parts of southern Yemen, which traditionally had very little connections to that part of northwest Yemen from which Hussein Houthi came, and then ultimately Ansarullah grows from. So it's a large coalition. Again, the vast majority, 80% of the population of Yemen now live for 8 years under siege, under Ansarullah's governance. And that's not going to change. But that also, in the end, makes the project of taking Yemen's natural resources and making sure Yemen never becomes a unified enterprise again much easier, ironically enough. You just have to contain these people in a big concentration camp of the mountains of the north, and then you get all the lion's share of the gas and oil and offshore fisheries. Then And that's in the end a solution for what was ultimately the reason for this damn war in the first place, is to bring Yemen and integrate it into the global economy that would be serviceable to those who need the resources and need the potential for the revenues that could be produced from it, and to secure the regions for to the tracks of pipelines that are going to be that are envisioned to sustain things like these stupid Red Sea Vision 2030 that Saudi Arabia has been promoting, right? These casino towns on the Red Sea. You can't have that without water. You can't have that without food supply. That's going to come from the Horn of Africa. That's going to come from the highlands of Ethiopia. But that's only going to be possible if Yemen is somehow secured. They were literally going to build bridges that linked Djibouti with Yemen. The Bin Laden group had been commissioned to design these things, but everything started falling apart in the early 2000s and the financing fell apart. But the idea was to, using that dam that they were damming the Blue Nile, to create this vast farmlands of highland Ethiopia, who would produce the food to make sure and then avail the water from the dammed Blue Nile to make these cities possible. And maybe they will have in the end be able to secure pipelines in another way. But the cheapest route was through Yemen. And that's something that made the whole conflict understandable at the political economy side. Why invest in so much conflict on this country? It should have been won, according to Riyadh, the Americans, and Abu Dhabi and Doha, after 2 weeks, the war would have ended. They didn't imagine, because they're all trapped by this mythology about Yemen being a country that it's not. These are people who are principled, and they're articulate and understanding of what the dynamics are, and they collectively refuse to fall for what was ultimately an enterprise to secure Yemen's resources through some kind of religiously oriented dictatorship that had connections to either Doha or Saudi Arabia, and with the Americans, the Obama administration, as the mediator.
What are the pan-Arab implications of, for example, an actual Houthi victory, whatever that might look like? What are the ideological, geopolitical implications or stakes, I suppose, that?
The investment in Takfiri Islam, the investment since 1961 in training imams in Medina, in Saudi Arabia, to then disseminate them throughout the Islamic world, was primarily a function to use Islam against Muslims, and more importantly, Muslims with a certain kind of economical spirit that still existed on the streets of Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, in many cities of the Gulf, by the way. Most of these cities are inhabited by people coming from elsewhere, or lower class Emiratis or Saudis who don't win the lion's share of the considerable wealth produced from the oil gas industries. And that's been a problem since what they used to call the Arab Cold War. Since the 1940s and 50s, the people of the streets had very different interests than those who were in the palaces, who represent the political parties, and became quite clear, as we saw already in 2006 with the victory of Hezbollah over Israeli forces, that Hezbollah was the most popular party in all of the Arab world. They were flying Hezbollah flags in the so-called deepest heart of Gaza, of where all these supposedly hardcore Sunni Muslims are embedded, in Christian neighborhoods. Still today, in many parts of Lebanon, the biggest supporters of Hezbollah are certain groups of Christians in Lebanon. And they've been making every effort to avoid the consolidation and the collective articulation of that spirit. There's a logic why people on the streets supported Hezbollah's victory, or why they supported the resistance on the streets of occupied Palestine, or in other theaters where it wasn't messed up with all this contradictory language coming from media. We have to understand that Arab media is 85% owned by a couple of Gulf countries, or at least they're very powerful families in those Gulf countries. So most people, since the satellite era, don't read newspapers. They're listening to these satellite channels that are coming from Doha or from Saudi Arabia. And so their world is very confused. They have real economic and political values that they still maintain on a day-to-day basis. But then they understand the world through this prism of mass media. And that's why Hezbollah by 2006 became persona non grata in the Arab world discourse. It became the enemy. And you'll notice that there's this very important time frame where suddenly Hezbollah is being attacked by every single media outlet in the Arab world, let alone in the West, that's been the case for a long time. And there's a reason for that. It's because Hezbollah had popular support. And if people began to recognize, and some people do, I mean, you can travel to Jordan, you can travel in Beirut, you can go, certainly Syria, people recognize, but they have their own issues right now, horrible as it is. It's the same forces, however, that people that recognize the same elements that are destroying Libya, destroying Syria or Iraq, are the ones who are at war in Yemen to subordinate Yemenis. And again, if people were able to articulate that through media, if there was actually free media somewhere, if there was a channel on YouTube that was able to capture and allow for people to articulate in those terms, then you would actually see a widespread support. You walk the streets of Beirut, you'll find references to the struggle in Yemen, but they're immediately painted over. You will find sometimes journalists writing a sympathetic story about him. They will immediately be eliminated from. You won't find it in just like you noted from the very beginning of the interview that suspiciously there's not one word mentioning Yemen for 8 years, right? Very rarely do we hear it, unless, of course, Ansarullah fires a homemade drone into Abu Dhabi or to Riyadh airports. Then it's the evil Iranian-backed Houthis who are refusing to end the war. And this is what's basically the strategy moving forward, is to say that basically the warmongers are the Houthis themselves. They're the ones who started this war. They're the ones who overthrew the recognized government of Mansour Hadi, which was not a recognized government. It was a government imposed by the United States Embassy in 2012. That being said, the narrative is that, and it's again goes back to this whole rewriting of history of this region, in which the the Zaydis are backwards, who are medievalists, and they haven't modernized. To they're connected to these monarchies, which was not the case. To now Houthis are Iranian-backed fanatics like Hezbollah are. But that's a very dangerous track because people can decipher some of this propaganda, and they do in common company. It's not easy, however, to have these conversations in certain settings because of security forces. They will immediately shut you down if you're having these kinds of conversations in public spaces. It's a very repressive environment in the Arabic language media and in the Arabic language day-to-day conversations about what's happening in the world. I mean, people are furious about these capitulations to the story about Israel and Palestine. They're furious now about this Saudi rehabilitation of Saudi Arabia with making relations with Syria and Iran. But people in those societies who have been fighting all these years are now, what is this Raisi in Iran doing? There are tens of thousands of Shia in prison in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, being tortured every day, on the principle of human justice and of freedom. These are the very things that supposedly fought the Iranian Revolution for. And the Ansar Allah, you got me speaking in terms of they're not Houthis, they're Ansar Allah, they're Yemenis. They also very quickly said that we will never allow Iran to dictate the terms of our relationship in this war with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is an enemy to Yemen. And yet they constantly made a point of emphasis that Tehran does not represent our interests. That you will not negotiate an end of the war through Tehran. And recently, a couple of days ago, Tehran said, we don't represent events in Yemen, and we're not going to. But for Iran, it makes sense. It gives them some leverage to claim that they have influence over various conflict zones in parts of the world where, in fact, they don't. And it's counterproductive for people who are in solidarity of what's going on in Yemen, as on principle what it represents. It's a resistance to globalization. It's resistance to all the evil mechanisms that are being applied onto humanity in various shapes and forms, from Islamic fundamentalism to these monarchies who are very vicious and use mercenaries to wage war on non-compliant populations, to stealing people's natural resources, which is happening in Yemen right now. China and American or French companies, Austrian companies have been stealing billions from Yemen without paying a government one penny for the last 8 years.
Well, it sounds based on that Ansar Allah, I'll try to call them by that more instinctively, that they seem to stand quite a good chance of capturing a lot of that constituency, because these dynamics that you've been explaining are not becoming less glaringly obvious to people. They're becoming much more apparent.
And hence the investment in trying to complicate or try to confuse the narrative, referring them to some charismatic man, make it a personal movement of the Houthis, right? I mean, this is how, unfortunately, in the West, we often talk about politics of the global South, that it's all inspired by some charismatic guy, and we can then demonize the entire project to being Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or this Houthi fellow, where in fact what actually is happening is a broad coalition of actors that, once people start to recognize that, and it actually can become, it gains momentum, that we can actually speak about what's happening in Yemen as part of a larger phenomenon. That's the whole point of my book, is that I made this story a global story. It is a global story. It is a story that is repeated in Congo. It's repeated in Somalia, in the Horn of Africa, in our cities in Europe and in Australia. I mean, there's no reason why people around the world, I mean, this is what Marx beseeched people to recognize, right? Cast aside your religious differences, your racial differences. We're all, in the end, we're facing a common economic crisis and struggle. The working class.
Well, having hammered home the fact of it being a broad coalition, realistically, how much broader do you think that coalition could get, like in the sense of beyond Yemen itself?
Well, in Yemen itself, what's important about this war is it's not being fought from the so-called coalition side, the so-called international community. It's largely being, the manpower is mostly mercenaries from Sudan, primarily Sudan. Poor guys are just kind of left out in the middle of nowhere being killed, or poor elements of the society. I mean, UAE and Saudis have to send their own citizens now, which is not good over the long term, to have boys coming home in coffins, as we know from all wars. So that, in that sense, again, in a very quiet way, a lot of Yemenis have stayed out of the war, and they're increasingly becoming more invested in this war because their own immediate interests are being shaped by the ultimate objectives of this war for the Saudi Arabia, UAE, for instance. So areas that are not under siege, let's say the borders with Oman, it's called Mahra, for instance. It is now, there are American troops, there are American bases there, and the American bases are now under attack from the local population, who are largely left out of the war. And the leaders of these communities who are on the coast or in the interior remained until very, very recently quiet. But now they've starting to recognize the fault of that strategy, because now this has become a de facto solution to the fact that they couldn't suppress Yemeni people, so they're going to now parcel out Yemen. And so this whole border area with Oman is going to be a conduit for Saudi Arabia to gain access to the Arabian Sea. And Mahra, by extension of, if they move the territories a little bit inwards, westwards, could also be a major zone for oil production and exploitation. It also has a very large coastline that extends even to these very beautiful islands of Socotra, for instance, which are now under occupation of the UAE, a rival of Saudi Arabia in this whole war. So this can very easily induce a large scale, not necessarily defection, but a decision to actually get into the violence of this war that many have been on the sidelines. And throughout early 2023, when Ansar Allah was actually gaining ground, and which induced the ceasefire in the first place, when Biden came in, Ansar Allah was about to take over Marib, the big oil producing area of, of central Yemen, of eastern Yemen. And that resulted in an immediate change of strategy, if you will. Ansar Allah had unleashed a series of drone attacks in Jeddah, in Riyadh. They blew up oil refineries. They even attacked again Abu Dhabi. And it became quite clear that very quickly momentum was changing. A large numbers of these neutral elements inside Yemen were now driving to the front lines and saying, in solidarity, we shared a common cause with Ansar Allah, that this is a Yemeni cause. So things were getting very, in the early 2023, so not that long ago, very, very dangerously sliding into a potential disaster. Sorry, 2022. Time flies in this horrible war in some ways. But things were getting out of hand when Biden was just coming into power. And that, I think, could easily translate into pockets of solidarity. Again, as I mentioned, you could see spray painted in many cities of the Arab world solidarity to the movement in Yemen to fight a common enemy, the ultra rich, those who are willing to capitulate and sell off this long multiple generation struggle for dignity, for economic freedom and independence. The fact that this generation of MBZ, MBS are not only torturing their own people, but unleashing proxy wars against Arab peoples around the region, and also making deals with Israel. This is all now creating common ground for people who, at least at the superficial day-to-day experience, were not going to invest in embracing the Yemen cause. They learned to keep quiet about Hezbollah, showing their support for Hezbollah, even though Hezbollah are the only ones who produced any results that people across the board could support in 2006. And there is a danger there that if you start seeing more and more information about what's going on and allowing people to actually speak about this, and there's going to be a breaking point when people say enough is enough. I mean, now we have economic austerity being imposed on all the world, right? But economic austerity, especially in the look at Beirut, Lebanon, is all their bank accounts have been frozen. That's the kind of encroachment of a new kind of economy that Europeans and Australians are experiencing in a still minor way, but it could translate in something that extends beyond the Arab world. That's where it should go. Again, we all have something in common with those poor people in Yemen. That's the ultimate point I'm making here. And there are a lot of investment in stopping us from thinking about it in those terms. So it's very interesting moment when people start to recognize and actually hear about for the first time just how common their struggle in Yemen is to people in Congo or to people elsewhere. And if people start making the connections, that it extends to even our struggles in so-called post-industrial West, where we're going to be now facing the same kind of forces and pressures from the same actors who are waging war in Yemen. There could be something that actually, more importantly for the people of Yemen, ends up in the day-to-day discussions of people in the West. Because that's when, unfortunately, for right reasons or for wrong reasons, that's when wars begin and end, is when, to the extent to what happens in Western media, or what happens amongst Western intellectuals. For the most part, they've remained quiet about Yemen, or they've mobilized the narrative that has been presented to them through New York Times or the similar kinds of media outlets, corporate media that's most people rely on for their news.
Well, that would seem to suggest that they represent a far more serious threat than that silence would suggest.
Or the silence does suggest, in fact, that if we actually start letting people find a common cause with it, this actually can be a working model moving forward for how societies organize themselves. Because it's a remarkable story of how they organize. They've been in embargo for 8 years. They can't get anything in and out. How could Iran provide missile technology or provide missiles or arms? The only weapons that they get are from the former Yemeni army or from the ones they capture from the soldiers who run out, the Sudanese soldiers who run away from their very modern equipment that they are given and said, go and fight these principled people, these people who are in trenches and who will never give up. They haven't given up for 8 years. They've been starving to death. They've been dying of cholera, been bombed by the most horrific experimental ordinances. I mean, you just look at some of the videos and the stuff that's coming out of these bombs, and they haven't capitulated. They're all their infrastructure has been destroyed. Their traditional ways of reallocating the waters from the monsoons, which makes it such a rich country, agriculturally speaking, is in shambles. And yet they somehow are surviving, and they're not killing each other, right? That's a remarkable thing that I just look at people driving on a train, a commuter train in Netherlands, and they're killing each other over a seat. You know, that's there's something that it's not it's not evident. There have been attempts at creating that kind of division inside northern this pocket of resistance, where some 20 million people live in isolation from the rest of the world, but it hasn't translated into um, a deviation from the common cause, which is survival, and on their terms. Whether or not people in the end will give up is another thing, but for 8 years they haven't, and that's quite remarkable.
I wonder if this is almost like far too expansive a question to even give an answer to, but what would you expect an Arab world that takes Yemen as its point of reference? What would that look like?
You would definitely see what I call empire. So the coalition of postmodern, post-industrial states, or whatever they are, waging war across the board. And they will not, unfortunately, there's no, at this stage in our collective human history, no possibility of that happening. And we can see that with the case of Yemen. Already, I mean, China and Russia have been on board with the international community, so to speak, since day one. They've been the ones who have been enforcing the embargo. They have their ships also inspecting anything that comes in and out of the one port that remains in northern Yemen open. That China is regularly bringing tankers to the ports of southern Yemen and drawing without paying, or at least they're paying certainly pennies on the dollar of for that oil that's being extracted.
So, I
They're
mean,
selling.
if
Mhm.
the Arab world writ large were to basically follow the example of Yemen, I mean, you're saying that the siege on Yemen would be multiplied 1,000-fold against all the Arab countries.
I mean, it's the story of the 20th century, suppressing the ability of the peoples of the global south to politically organize and determine and dictate the direction in which their societies go. They didn't embrace globalization. They didn't embrace liberal values. It was imposed on them. And the machinations extended from political assassination to genocide when necessary to starvation politics, whether it be in India or China, parts of Europe, for goodness sake. There's been two major wars in the 20th century to um, um, determine the fate of European working class. And the same applies to the Arab world. They've had moments during the late Ottoman Empire of trying to lead a collective enterprise that didn't subscribe to sectarianism or to ethnic linguistic difference and nationalism. There was that economical moment, even at the very later stage of the Ottoman Empire, and it extended to this idea: let's create an Arab League, let's create an Arab Union. They still exist on paper, but those are now run by societies that are ruled by family dictatorships that are to a large extent, the product of British, French, American politics, strategic thinking, and that's so we can go back to square one, but a lot has been lost over this 130-year period. A whole generation of children now are growing up not even able to critically read anything, let alone aspire to and actually be able to work together. Everyone's fascinated with football teams, and loyalties are dispersed by sectarianism, which then again didn't exist in the period prior to a British occupation of Egypt in 1882. That's when they started to invest through their control of Al-Azhar, and the university system that existed in Egypt, where they trained imams. That's when they started investing in this sectarianism. And then with Saudi Arabia, that became another important asset to continuously disaggregate the peoples of the global South, and use, this is my phrase, use Islam against Muslim. It became a faith of distinction, and of cordoning off each other's communities, where there was clearly they could have gone in the opposite direction. And the Imamate and Ansar Allah and some of these isolated groups still promote this idea of universal cause, that we all universally, despite our differences, have common cause. You look at the demonstrations in the streets, the pictures that come from the streets, they have the images of universal struggle. It's not something that's unique to Zaydis or to people of the northwest of Yemen. It's something that's for all Yemenis, but more importantly, they're making overtures to the larger world. This is a cause that all of us in the larger world. In places like Yemen, they were not developed, right? Developed in the negative sense, enough to basically capitulate. They were still willing to fight. Many parts of the Arab world today are too developed, too integrated. Too many able-bodied men and women have different objectives now. They want careers. I don't think they could actually, I mean, could people in the West collectively organize anymore? Because we're all driven by sometimes very common causes, but those common causes are very different from sacrificing for each other, sacrificing for your neighbor. That's clearly not going to happen in the Arab world anymore either. But there's still enough concern that people who are in horrible situation, living in slums, who have lost everything to this austerity that's been imposed by IMF in Egypt or in Lebanon, Syria, even in Saudi Arabia, if they just caught a little bit of what these Ansar Allah is really about, maybe there's a chance for us to do something accordingly. Similarly, at least to pay lip service to what they're fighting for.
Well, I mean, you don't seem to sound particularly optimistic, but based on everything you're saying, kind of it suggests that perhaps another one of those historical moments is occurring, and that time may be on the side of these northern Yemeni farmers. Essentially, they may push changes that extend far beyond Yemen itself.
Well, I don't unfortunately think that that's going to happen. I think the extent of their success and their victory will be that they are left alone. Whether or not they can actually work that out, or are they going to suffer continuously and live in this concentrated zone, much like what happened to many parts of Cecil Rhodes' former Southern Africa regions, where you just put into these enclaves and just live a life of misery, where you'll eventually send your son to go find a cheap job somewhere outside of our concentrated zone. They will, remain free, but in poverty, in maybe even a permanent state of war, which is a very sad fate for them. But I don't think their movement is going to spread. I think Yemen is destroyed as a country. It doesn't exist anymore as a unified country. It will not ever manifest collectively again, much like Libya or Iraq or Syria. And So that's unfortunately the long term and medium term. The short term is that it's still dangerous to talk about Yemen in these terms. It's still something that it could lead to trouble elsewhere because we're going through a transitional phase. The Gulf countries are in big financial problems. It goes back to 2008, even earlier. And one of the reasons why this war was necessary for these three rival Gulf countries is because they were seeking for gaining access to Yemen's resources, and more importantly, to assure that the other two rivals didn't get access to them. And again, Yemen is a very rich country, as is Congo, as are much of Africa and much of Southeast Asia. And yet the people who live in these very rich countries are very, very poor and are living horrible lives and will live very few days of calm. And that for me is incredibly damning about our world and the 20th and 21st century, that people who deserve so much better, who are so kind and giving and will give you everything just to accommodate you and extend an arm of friendship, are the ones who are suffering the most. It's as if almost they lack that cynicism to actually be mean enough to make it in the next stage of our collective development, which is a race to the bottom for most of us. And the Yemenis are the ones who still fight, and people in Congo, my goodness, those poor people. 7 million have died in these horrible wars led by militias to basically open up their fields and their forests for cobalt mining and for God knows what else they're digging out of their earth.
Well, I was kind of hoping that maybe we could end this conversation on a somewhat more optimistic note. But I guess in an attempt to do that, for people that are very much invested in these stories and following events such as those in Yemen, I'm thinking particularly in countries like Australia, countries in Europe and North America, and so on. What would you encourage them to do
Well,
about it?
certainly talk about it and um, engage and link. So the conversation doesn't have to be about Yemen, but just link what's happening in Yemen to what's happening in Melbourne or what's happening to people in the crisis of day-to-day life that people in the middle class have to experience. They're going to go through the same kind of um, tensions that if collectively people are organized, they may actually have some recourse and actually be able to push back a little bit. And I think, again, it's necessary to make and link all of our collective struggles and avoid isolating them as being something that's particular to Yemen or the Arab world or the Islamic world or the global South. And their story is our story. And unfortunately, our politics ends up being their politics. And our economic needs become the cost they have to pay in order to be integrated into global economies, right? We want our energy efficient cars and our battery powered whatever, and where does that stuff come from? It's the same dynamic with the petroleum industry, right? We often conveniently distance ourselves from the people who actually provide us the things that make our no longer. It's not going to be that much longer where we're going to be living austerity as well in the so-called West, unless you're a millionaire and you're well connected and you're protected. If you have a mortgage, if you're going to be in the same boat. I don't say that we're going to be in a war. I don't think we have the ability to do what Ansar Allah and the people of Yemen have done, just collectively work together to stand up for 8 years under siege. I think we would capitulate very, very quickly and turn on each other, as was demonstrated in the last couple of years.
Well, I could certainly continue talking about your analysis of Yemen for many more hours, but for people that want to be better acquainted with your work on the region, where can they find it?
I don't have any of these self-promoting websites, things like that. But you can find my articles, I guess, on Google Scholar. I hate to promote Google, but that's one way to find my books on Yemen, specific to Yemen. Could be in your local library. If not, then ask them to get. Public libraries did have a function at some point, but specific to Yemen, yeah, I've written mostly books called Destroying Yemen, another book called Chaos in Yemen, 2010, and I'm frequently interviewed. I appear weekly on a program on TNT. I don't know if this is a program that you guys in Australia are familiar with, but called
So,
Perspective. But it's easy. I'm easy to find if you just type my name in. And I appreciate the offer of letting me talk, Sam. It was good to meet you, and good to meet your audience. And
thank you. Likewise. Well, I
I do.
hope that we can probably discuss again when further developments have occurred, and maybe despite your expectations, hopefully more positive developments. But
Inshallah,
we will
stay
see. Indeed, very much
safe.
so. Well, if you wanted to give any kind of final thoughts before we wrap up.
To your listeners, Sam, again, just you listening to this program is, for me, enough. At least I have an opportunity to share with you what's happening in Yemen. So please do try to read more broadly than just the immediate available information about Yemen, because it's often very explicitly distortive. And I can assure you that it's something that is very much you have in common. What's happening in Yemen is also of our concern, whether it's in Australia or elsewhere, the English speaking. So thank you again, Sam.
I can definitely second that. So thank you very much again.